Hey, how's it going? So today I'm going to talk about American foreign policy. American foreign policy is a complete disaster, and it is hurting the Americans most of all. Okay? And so you have to understand that the people who are running American foreign policy right now are the most incompetent people ever that has ever run the foreign policy of a major nation, of even a second or third tier nation. The American foreign policy establishment, they're morons. They are complete fools. And let me explain why. Because right now what's going on is that these guys are completely hysterical. Completely hysterical. Because the war in Ukraine is not going as they thought it would go. The whole sanctions thing is a big disaster. And they are doing two things simultaneously, both of which, either one of which, would be a disaster for any coherent foreign policy. And what are they doing? Number one, they are antagonizing potentially friendly countries when they need not antagonize them. And on the other hand, they are deliberately and purposefully destroying the economies of friendly and allied nations. Their own allies, they are destroying them. And let me go through it one by one, okay? So let's talk about the antagonism that the Americans are inflicting on anyone who's not on their side. I mean, quite apart from the fact that, the Russia-China situation, where they have declared Russia and China their avowed enemies and want regime change in both countries. It's the stupidest thing imaginable to outright say, you're our enemies, we're going to get you come hell or high water. I mean, that's just stupid. That's what the American foreign policy establishment is doing. They have these avowed, declared enemies, Russia and China, but at the same time, they are antagonizing a whole host of countries that they need not antagonize. And the principal ones that they are antagonizing are India and Turkey, and to a lesser extent, Iran. And I'm going to get to each of them in turn. Now, let's take India. India is a very large country. It is by population the largest country in the world, as a matter of fact. And as the Indians themselves always say, they are the world's largest democracy. Good on them. Now, India has had long-standing ties with Russia from way back when they were the Soviet Union. People don't seem to remember this, but there were times after independence in 1949 that India's situation was very precarious, especially in regards to Pakistan. And so the Indians and the Russians, the Soviets back then, they developed a very strong relationship, and the Soviets were always helpful to the Indians, always supportive of the Indians insofar as credits for food were concerned, weaponry, all kinds of stuff. Not to mention technical assistance and whatnot. The ties between the Soviet Union then, Russian Federation today, between them and India are very long-standing. And so India sees the situation going on in Ukraine, and on the one hand, India, looking after its own best interests, doesn't want to antagonize the West. But on the other hand, they don't want to antagonize a country that is right on their back door, who has always helped them over the decades, and on top of that, is their major supplier of energy. I mean, you can forget about the history and the good feeling between the two countries going back since who knows when. The fact that right now India depends on the energy supply from Russia, well, what does that tell you? Are the Indians going to piss off the Russians? Hell no, of course not, All they have to do is look at what happened to poor Europe. The European Union, all these sanctions and all this feel-good bullshit, and what's happened to them? No Russian energy? That means that they're going to go cold, dark, and hungry, and without even cell phones, for crying out loud, this winter. It's already happening. We're seeing it in Great Britain, and we're soon enough going to be seeing it in Germany. This is a catastrophe for the European economy, the sanctions. It deprived the Europeans of cheap energy. The cheap energy that is no longer flowing from Russia to Europe. Oh, no. Now it's flowing from Russia to India. And India, are they happy? Fuck yeah! They're thrilled. And so they're not going to antagonize that relationship. But the American foreign policy establishment is relentless in pressuring India by means fair and foul to sanction Russia. India is never going to do that. And the more pressure the Americans put on the Indians, the more it's just going to antagonize the Indians because they understand their best interests. They don't want to send troops, Indian troops, to mess around in Ukraine. Of course not. They're never going to do that, and the Russians wouldn't need that. But they are never going to piss off the guy who is supplying the gasoline and the natural gas and all those necessary energy resources. But the Americans insist on this. And they are undermining America's relationship with India in order to force India, twisting their arm to sanction Russia. And that just pisses off the Indians. And it's not going to change a goddamn thing. Now, what about the Turks? Well, Turkey, historically, since way back, since it was, the Byzantine Empire, it's always had this balancing act. It's the gateway between the East and the West. And so they've always had this balancing act of playing nice with both sides, with the East and the West, and sometimes playing them off each other to their own advantage. Well, why not? If you've got the chance, do it. But the Turks, Erdogan, now, they have no interest in pissing off the Russians, but the American foreign policy establishment is pressuring the Turks, twisting their arms to get them to get on the sanctions bandwagon, which, again, the Turks, just like the Indians, see what's happened insofar as the European economy is concerned, and they want no piece of that, especially because Turkey's domestic economic situation is very precarious. The lira there, nothing to do with me, but the lira there is, oh boy, all kinds of trouble there, right? And so the Americans are twisting the arm of the Turks. And then what did Putin do? I mean, you got to admire the brilliance of the man. Whatever you might think of him, the guy is sharp. The guy is smart and very rational. Because of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, and because the Ukraine, the Zelensky regime, has cut off the pipelines from Russia to Europe, they cut them arbitrarily for no reason. It wasn't the Russians who shut it off. It was the Zelensky regime. Well, there's only one major pipeline going from Russia to the West. There are others, but it's not important insofar as this conversation is concerned. But the point is, Turkstream, the Turkstream pipeline. Putin offered to Erdogan, the president of Turkey, for Turkey to be the exclusive supplier of energy for the West. Now, Turkey, you got to understand the relationship of Turkey to Europe. See, Turkey is the stopgap for all the flood of Syrian and other Middle Eastern refugees to go to Europe. Were it not for Turkey, all of those millions, plural, of refugees would flow into Europe. That's one of the swords of Damocles that Turkey has hanging over the head of the Europeans, right? And now Putin, on a platter, here you go. He's offering Erdogan and the Turks to be the exclusive supplier of energy resources, natural gas, to Europe. He's offering to build Turkstream 2, and which would be far bigger. And there's also been the issue, of course, that the Turkstream 1 pipeline, there was attempted sabotage of it. And we all know who was behind that, of course. The same people who were behind the Nord Stream pipeline disaster. The Americans, okay? Either directly or indirectly through the Brits. But somebody was messing around with the Turkstream pipelines. They were able to nip that in the bud. But the Turks are on notice. And now the Russians are offering them another pipeline for more gas, and that way Turkey will have its hand, its grip, its iron grip on the natural gas faucet that the Europeans are going to need. Because there is no way for Europe to get the energy resources it needs from any other source. It'll take years to develop an alternate to the Russian energy. And of course, it'll take not only years to develop that, it'll be much more expensive. And so for the Turks to all of a sudden be the supplier of Europe's energy needs, it puts the Turks in the driver's position. Who made this happen? The Americans. Because instead of trying to be nice with the Turks and Erdogan, instead of trying to support Turkey through its difficult economic situation that it's going through, they just further twist the arm. Like, for instance, obliging all the Turkish banks to shut up the use of the mirror payment card, the one that's prevalent in Russia. part of the sanctions package, right? Yeah, the Americans succeeded in doing that. All the Turkish banks decided, okay, we're not going to use the Mir card. But what happened? The Turks and the Russians are developing a separate card system that will work in both countries. And so they're avoiding it, further alienating Turkey to no gain. That's the thing. In foreign policy, you have to have some sort of gain for whatever you're doing. But they are pressuring Turkey, thinking that the Turks somehow, by sanctioning Russia, it's also going to hurt Russia more, and it's not. Because, they shot their wad back in February, March, insofar as the sanctions are concerned, and the Russian economy came through with flying colors. So anything that, insofar as Turkey imposing sanctions on Russia, is that going to hurt the Russians? No, it's not. Is it going to hurt the Turks? Oh, yeah. And so the Turks, just like the Indians, have no interest in joining the sanctions bandwagon. They have no interest in alienating Russia. And on top of that, Putin gave them an incredibly good reason to be best buddies. And of course, this is going to have a huge influence insofar as a serious situation, but that's for another broadcast. The point that I'm trying to make in this thing, see, the Indians, they antagonize them. The Turks, they antagonize them. Now the Americans are antagonizing the Saudis. I forgot to mention the Saudis at the beginning of the show. Yeah, the Saudis. Who are the Saudis? They are the world's largest supplier of oil. I do believe they are the largest, or perhaps with Russia, the number 2. Doesn't matter. The point is that the Saudis, right, they are the big kahuna in OPEC. Even with OPEC plus being Russia, of course, they're still the big kahuna. And the Americans, what are they doing? Instead of making sure that the Saudis are on side, if not, sanctioning Russia, at least not antagonistic to the Americans. No. What does the American foreign policy establishment do? They start threatening to remove American weapons and American protection from Saudi Arabia. They are threatening this NOPEC bill. NOPEC is a bill that's been floating around for years, which is basically applying American and British antitrust laws on OPEC member states. Because after all, OPEC, what is it? It's a cartel to fix the price of oil. And what's the point of this cartel insofar as the countries that make up OPEC? It's to maintain a steady and predictable price for oil so they can plan production, their own economies, and all the rest of it, right? But this NOPEC bill that the Biden administration is now threatening to sign against Saudi Arabia, it would cause havoc to Saudi Arabia, especially insofar as Saudi's holdings in the United States. And notice too, by the way, parenthetically, they're threatening this antitrust legislation against Saudi Arabia and the OPEC member states, but not against big tech, which are all monopolies. They are prime targets for antitrust legislation, and they are not touching the big tech. But the Saudis and OPEC, yeah, that sure. Let's sanction them. Punish them. See, they're antagonizing the Saudis for no reason. And of course, what's happening with the Saudis? The Saudis, of course, they sell their oil in dollars because of William Simon or Walter Simon, I forget. I think it was William Simon. Back in 1974, he cut that deal that the Saudis would sell all of their petroleum, and OPEC in turn would sell its petroleum in dollars, not in any other currency. But now the Americans are so threatening the Saudis that the Saudis might figure, hey, might as well de-dollarize, which would devastate the American economy and drive inflation through the roof. If you think it's bad now, watch if Saudi Arabia de-dollarizes. Well, they are considering that because the Americans are threatening them. They threaten India. They threaten Turkey. They threaten Saudi Arabia. And of course, they're in Iran. They've run out of sanctions. They've thrown the kitchen sink in terms of sanctions are concerned at Iran. I mean, it's going on like 40 years now, right? 43 years at this point. Mm-hmm. And now they're trying to do a color revolution in Iran. Mm-hmm. I mean, all those protests that happened, it wasn't some poor girl who died. And by the way, she was not killed by Iranian security forces. We've seen the video. The poor thing dropped dead of a heart attack. Apparently she had a precondition going on years. I mean, the poor thing died, and that's an unfortunate thing, but these riots have nothing to do with this poor woman. And they have everything to do with the NGOs in Iran that are run by the CIA and other capitalist financiers who are allied to the American establishment and the American security forces. I mean, what's happening in Iran is Color Revolution 101, baby. We've seen this story before, seen it before. Been there, done that. And they're doing it in Iran. Further antagonizing the Iranians, who are now realizing, any kind of agreement with the Americans, they'll just throw it away. It'll mean nothing. We'll go through all the rigmarole of trying to get out from under the boot of sanctions, and they'll just throw it away. And so what are the Iranians doing? Like the Indians, like the Turks, like the Saudis too, they're getting closer to Russia, a lot closer. People say that these drones that are being deployed here, the true weapon that seems to be a game changer, of all the bullshit talk about all these game-changing weapons, these drones, the flying Doritos, the flying lawnmowers, they seem to really be a game changer. But anyway, the Iranians are getting a lot closer to the Russians. The Saudis are getting a lot closer to the Russians. All of this hysteria on the part of the foreign policy establishment, they only know how to press the accelerator. They only know how to squeeze. They only know how to threaten and bully, instead of working with these countries, understanding the motivations of these countries, trying to work with them, trying to improve the situation, the internal domestic situation of, say, Turkey, which really needs it, or India, or Iran, or Saudi Arabia. No. It's this bullying tactic. And so it alienates these countries. And these countries are extraordinarily important for what they produce insofar as oil is concerned, or their geographic position, which is so crucial in the case of Turkey, or for the fact that India is the future. I mean, whatever you might think of China, India, and the other countries around the world, the big ones, India is the future. It has this enormous population, extraordinarily well educated. I mean, people say that it's going to be China's century. It might be India's century, quite frankly. And I say that with admiration, and I'm not trying to belittle any country. I'm just saying, the demographic facts of India. They are now a big deal, and they will become an even bigger deal. And who is their best bud? The Russians, which is exactly what the foreign policy establishment of the United States does not want to happen, but it is happening because of what the foreign policy establishment in the United States is doing right now. And then they go around like headless chicken, trying to find some source of oil to replace the energy needs of Europe, to replace some of the energy needs of the United States, and no success, no joy. They're going everywhere instead of the people that they should be going to, which is Iran and Saudi Arabia, and of course Russia, and making nice with them. But no, they only know how to hit the accelerator. But that's insofar as the other countries, insofar as being a friend of the United States, of being an ally of the United States. The Americans are pushing these states to pursue policies that hurt them. The sanctions destroyed the European economy. Okay, I said earlier that the Europeans are going to go without, lights, internet, heating, and food, and that's the truth. Okay, it's the truth, and everybody could predict this back in February. Some of us did. All these sanctions are hurting Europe. They're all going to go cold, dark, and hungry this winter. And what do the Europeans do? They take it. All the Europeans know that the Americans destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines. They all know it. The fact that Sweden, just yesterday, announced that they are not going to release any information as to their investigation proves that point. Because if it had been Russia and there were clues or evidence showing that Russia had done it, it would be front page news. But the Nord Stream pipeline is being memory holed as we speak. Because everybody knows it's the Americans who did it. And the democratically elected leadership of Europe, rather than looking out for the best interests of their own people, as the other aforementioned countries are doing, well, the European leaders are doing policies, pursuing policies, to the benefit of the United States, rather than their own people. The Americans have turned Europe into vassal subjects with no democratic redress to the people's justified grievances. And so the people of Europe, what are they doing? They're protesting. And is this carried in the in the mainstream media? No, of course not. Why? because the European leadership is suppressing it, because the European leadership takes its orders not from the people who elected them, but from Washington, from the foreign policy establishment in the United States. They are destroying their own allies. Similar issues, well, not quite the same, but similar issues are going insofar as Korea and Japan are concerned. Pressure from the United States that's hurting Korea and Japan. What is happening insofar as the foreign policy establishment of the United States is concerned? The reason that they are hysterical, the reason they are alienating people who potentially could be friendly to them and crushing their own allies, is because the foreign policy establishment of the United States recognizes that the global American empire is collapsing. I've only been talking about the foreign policy stuff. I haven't been talking about the domestic economic situation in the United States. The United States is an empty shell, industrially speaking. The fact that it cannot produce the weapons necessary for the Zelensky regime forces to conduct its war against Russia, that kind of like proves the point. Industrially, the United States is hollowed out. And because of the over-indebtedness of the past 40-odd years, the United States has been kicking the can down the road for so long that finally got to the point that the can is too big to kick any further. We're there insofar as American domestic policy is concerned, and I'll talk about that in a separate video. But for this video, I want you to understand that everything that the United States is doing insofar as a foreign policy level is concerned is hysteria, because they recognize that they are collapsing. Understand what's going on.